somewhere past -40 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to freeze a rifle bolt shut, cold enough to turn spit into ice before it hits the ground. On a single dirt road surrounded by frozen lakes, roughly 3,600 Finnish soldiers were about to face nearly 25,000 Soviet troops, backed by tanks, artillery, and the full weight of the largest army on Earth. By the time the snow melted, the road was not a road anymore. It was a 5-mile-long graveyard of steel and men, and the army that Stalin had sent to crush a country of 3.5 million people had simply ceased to exist. This is not a legend. This is not exaggerated for effect. Every number, every name, every frozen body in the snow that we're about to describe comes from military records, Finnish and Soviet archives, and the testimonies of the men who were there. What happened in Finland during the winter of 1939 and 1940 humiliated the Soviet Union in front of the entire world, and it started with a lie. Stick with us to the end, because the way this war ended will tell you everything about what real courage costs. To understand how impossible this fight was supposed to be, you need the numbers first. The Soviet Union, in 1939, had a population of roughly 170 million people. Finland had 3.5 million, smaller than the city of Los Angeles today. The Red Army that crossed the border on the 30th of November had access to thousands of tanks and thousands of aircraft. Finland's entire air force numbered around 100 planes, many of them outdated. The Soviets could field armies in the hundreds of thousands. Finland's standing army, before mobilization, was around 33,000 men. On paper, this wasn't a war. It was supposed to be an execution. So why did it happen? A few months earlier, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, with a secret clause dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Finland fell into Stalin's half. The official reason the Kremlin gave was security. Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second-largest city, sat barely 20 miles from the Finnish border. Stalin wanted that border pushed back, and he wanted a naval base on Finnish soil. Finland refused to hand over that land. So on the 26th of November 1939, Soviet artillery shelled the Russian village of Mainila, right on the border, and the Kremlin immediately blamed Finland for the attack. It was a fabricated pretext, something even later Soviet officials would admit to. 4 days later, without a declaration of war, Red Army bombers were over Helsinki, and Soviet divisions crossed the border on every front. Stalin expected this to take 2 weeks. He had already prepared a puppet Finnish government to install once Helsinki fell. He had no idea what he was walking into. Here's what the Kremlin's planners never put in their calculations. The Finnish people did not see this as a war they could afford to lose gracefully. This was their home, their families, their churches, their land. And for a deeply Lutheran, tightly bonded society, surrender was never treated as an option worth discussing. The man in charge of pulling this off was Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, a 72-year-old former Imperial Russian cavalry officer who'd already lived through one empire's collapse and Finland's own brutal civil war. He took command of the Finnish defense forces on the very first day of the invasion. Most men his age were retired. He was about to spend the next 3.5 months holding together a nation that didn't have enough rifles to arm half its own reservists, because that was the brutal truth at the start. Finland didn't have enough uniforms. It didn't have enough weapons. Men reported for duty in their own farm clothes, carrying hunting rifles their grandfathers had used. What Finland did have was something no factory could produce. Men who had grown up skiing through these exact forests, hunting in this exact cold, who knew every frozen lake and every logging trail better than any general in Moscow ever could. And they had something else. Historical accounts, including personal letters and later interviews with soldiers, describe congregations gathering in freezing churches to pray before their men left for the front. A country built on the conviction that this fight, however hopeless it looked on a map, was a fight worth everything they had. The Soviets were about to learn just how far that conviction would carry a nation the world had already written off. Quick question before we go further. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching this from. It always surprises us how far these stories travel. The main Soviet thrust came where everyone expected it, the Karelian Isthmus, the narrow strip of land between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga, the most direct route to Helsinki. Here Finland had built its one real line of defense, a network of trenches, bunkers and anti-tank obstacles that the world would come to call the Mannerheim Line. It was nowhere near as strong as Soviet propaganda later claimed, and nowhere near as strong as it needed to be against the force coming at it. But it didn't need to be a fortress. It needed to be held by men who were not going to run. Wave after wave of Soviet infantry and armor threw themselves against those positions through December. And wave after wave, they were thrown back, bogged down by minefields, cut apart by machine gun fire from bunkers the Soviets hadn't mapped correctly, and stalled by their own tanks getting stuck in terrain nobody in Moscow had bothered to scout. For the first time since the Russian Revolution, the Red Army, the army that was supposed to be the unstoppable spearhead of world communism, was being stopped cold by a country a fraction of its size. The Isthmus, though, wasn't where this war would actually be decided. That happened 400 miles north, in a frozen wilderness most maps of the era barely bothered to name, around a small logging town nobody outside Finland had ever heard of, and was about to become impossible to forget. The town was called Suomussalmi. Before the war it was home to about 4,000 loggers, hunters and farmers, tucked into a landscape of forests and frozen lakes near Finland's central border. Strategically, it barely mattered, until Soviet planners looked at a map and saw something tempting. A road running west from Suomussalmi toward the city of Oulu on Finland's coast. If Soviet forces could punch through there, they could cut the entire country in half. The Soviet High Command sent the 163rd Rifle Division, over 13,000 men, across the border toward Suomussalmi. They captured the village on the 7th of December. It should have been the beginning of the end. Instead, it became a trap. Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo took command of Finland's 9th Division, a force built almost entirely from reservists, but reservists who had spent their entire lives on skis in these exact woods. Silasvuo made a decision that ran against everything Soviet doctrine expected an outmatched defender to do. He didn't dig in and wait to be overrun. He attacked. Finnish ski troops, dressed in white to vanish against the snow, began cutting the roads behind the Soviet advance. They struck field kitchens, supply convoys and isolated units. Never in the massed frontal battles the Red Army was built to win, but in fast, brutal ambushes that appeared and disappeared into the trees before Soviet forces could even organize a response. By the 28th of December, the 163rd Division, the force that was supposed to slice Finland in two, had been surrounded, starved and broken. But the Soviets had already sent reinforcements down a single icy road to save them. And that road was about to earn a name that still makes Finnish military historians go quiet when they say it. The Finns had a word for what they did next: motti. In peacetime, a motti is nothing dramatic. It's just a stack of firewood, logs cut and piled to a standard size for burning. But applied to warfare, it became one of the most devastating tactics of the entire Second World War. And it worked precisely because of a weakness Soviet doctrine could never fix in time. Their divisions were tied to the roads. Heavy artillery, tanks, and motorized supply columns couldn't move through Finnish forest and marsh. They were forced into long, single-file lines strung out for miles. The motti tactic was simple to describe and brutal to experience. Finnish ski troops, faster, lighter, and invisible in the white terrain, would scout a Soviet column, then strike its front and rear simultaneously, sealing the road at both ends. With the column trapped and unable to move forward or back, the Finns would split it into smaller and smaller segments, cutting off each one from the others. Every motti became an island with no way out, no resupply, no reinforcement, no retreat. And then the Finns waited. Trapped without food, without fuel for their vehicles, and without shelter from a cold that was now dropping past minus 30 degrees Celsius, entire Soviet units would begin to freeze and starve inside their own encirclement, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, before the Finns moved in to finish what the winter had already started. It was not a tactic born from a training manual. Nothing like it appeared in Finland's pre-war doctrine. It was invented, out of pure necessity, by men who understood their own terrain and their own limits better than the world's largest army understood either. and it was about to be used on a scale that would turn a stretch of frozen dirt road into one of the most one-sided military disasters of the entire 20th century. The Soviet 44th Rifle Division, somewhere between 11 and 17,000 men, equipped with tanks, motorized transport and artillery, was ordered to march west along the Rate Road to rescue the trapped 163rd Division at Suomussalmi. They never made it. Strung out for miles along a narrow, icebound track through dense forest, the 44th Division was exactly the kind of target the motti tactic was built for. Beginning in the first days of January 1940, Silasvuo's forces struck the column at multiple points at once, severing it into isolated pockets. Finnish ski patrols armed with submachine guns harassed the trucks. Small teams crept close enough to Soviet tanks to destroy them with satchel charges and improvised firebombs. Finnish artillery, dragged by hand through the forest because there were no roads to move it on, rained down on the packed, immobile Soviet vehicles below. The Soviet commander, Alexei Vinogradov, watched his division disintegrate around him, and then made the decision that sealed his own fate. He abandoned his troops and retreated toward the border. When he reached Soviet lines days later, he was court-martialed and executed for the disaster. By the time the fighting along Rate Road ended in the first week of January, the numbers told a story that even Soviet propaganda struggled to spin. Historians estimate Soviet losses at Suomussalmi and Rate Road combined at somewhere between 22,000 and 27,000 killed, wounded, or missing. The Finns lost under 1,000 men. The Finns captured 43 tanks, 70 field guns, nearly 300 trucks, machine guns by the hundreds, 6,000 rifles. Weapons that Finland, a country too poor to properly equip its own reservists 3 weeks earlier, desperately needed, and had just taken directly from the army that was supposed to erase it from the map. To this day, the Battle of Suomussalmi is studied as a tactical case study at the United States Military Academy and Britain's Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, not as a footnote, but as one of the clearest examples in modern history of how a smaller, disciplined force can annihilate a numerically overwhelming enemy through terrain, mobility, and sheer will. Before we go on, if stories like this deserve more attention than history class ever gave them, that's the whole reason this channel exists, and a like genuinely helps more people find it. Now, about the one man who, by himself, became more feared by the Red Army than most of Finland's entire artillery corps combined. His name was Simo Hayha. He was 34 years old when the war began, a farmer, a hunter, 5'3" tall, with no formal military sniper training. What he had was a lifetime spent stalking game through the exact forests he was now defending, and a stillness that made him nearly impossible to find. Hayha was assigned to the Kola River sector with Finland's 6th Company, Infantry Regiment 34. He used a standard-issue Finnish M2830 rifle, a Mosin Nagant variant, and deliberately refused a telescopic sight. A scope, he reasoned, could catch sunlight and give away his position, and it forced a shooter to raise his head higher above the snow line to use it. He trusted iron sights, patience, and a hunter's instinct instead. He built firing positions packed with snow to muffle the sound of his shots and steady his rifle, dressed entirely in white to disappear against the landscape, and waited, sometimes for hours, for Soviet soldiers to advance across open, predictable ground. On his best single day, the 21st of December 1939, Hayha is credited with 25 confirmed kills. Over roughly 100 days of fighting, Finnish military records and his own wartime diary put his total at somewhere between 500 and 542, the highest confirmed kill count of any sniper in recorded military history, a record that still stands today. The Red Army began calling him Belaya Smrt, the White Death. Soviet command grew so desperate to eliminate him that they targeted his suspected position with artillery barrages and dedicated counter-snipers, and still, for months, they couldn't find him. What's remarkable isn't only the number, it's the man behind it. Hayha never sought the fame that followed him. Decades later, when a journalist asked whether he felt any remorse for what he'd done, his answer was simple. He had done what he was told, as well as he could, and there would be no Finland left if every man hadn't done the same. And in a later reflection on that brutal Christmas of 1939, spent freezing in the trenches under constant attack, he said something that speaks to exactly the kind of resolve this entire war was built on. That even then, God was close to them, and they sang psalms. On the 6th of March 1940, just 6 days before the war ended, a Soviet bullet finally found him, shattering his jaw. He survived, underwent more than 24 surgeries, and lived quietly as a farmer for another 62 years, until his death in 2002 at the age of 96. Hayha, for all his legend, was still just one man. The rest of Finland's army didn't have his patience or his rifle. What they had was an entire nation's worth of improvisation and a glass bottle that would go on to outlive every general who fought this war. Finland entered this war without enough anti-tank guns to matter. So Finnish soldiers built their own answer. Bottles filled with gasoline, tar and potassium chlorate, lit and thrown at the engine grates and hatches of Soviet armor. It was crude, it was dangerous to use. And against tanks whose crews had never trained for this kind of close guerrilla-style combat, it worked. The name stuck for a reason rooted in dark humor. When Soviet bombers dropped incendiary cluster bombs on Finnish cities, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov claimed on state radio that the planes were actually delivering bread to the starving Finnish people. Finnish soldiers, unimpressed, started calling their improvised firebombs Molotov cocktails, a drink, they joked, to go along with Molotov's bread. The name spread around the world and is still used for improvised incendiary weapons today, in wars far removed from a Finnish forest in 1939. Almost nobody using the term now knows it began as a soldier's joke at a propagandist's expense. The tanks weren't the only Soviet weakness the Finns exploited. Soviet soldiers were issued dark khaki winter uniforms that stood out sharply against the white snow. Finnish troops wore white camouflage from head to boot, moved on skis their opponents had no equivalent for, and struck at the one target that mattered most in a war of extreme cold: the field kitchens. Cut off a frozen army's hot food, and you don't need to win every firefight. The cold itself starts fighting for you. None of this made the war winnable in the long run. Finland's population and industrial base were simply too small to survive an indefinite war of attrition against the Soviet Union. But it bought something that mattered just as much: time, casualties the Kremlin could not hide, and a story that was about to reach the front pages of every newspaper in the free world. By January 1940, what was happening in Finland's frozen forests had become an international sensation. The Soviet Union had invaded a small, peaceful neighbor without a declaration of war, using a fabricated border incident as its excuse, and the League of Nations formally condemned the attack and expelled the Soviet Union from the organization, the only time in its history it took that step against a member state. In Britain, Winston Churchill, not yet Prime Minister, but already one of the most prominent voices warning about the dangers of both fascism and Soviet communism, told the House of Commons that Finland showed the world what free men could do, and that no more sorrowful sight could exist than to watch such a fine northern people be worn down by an empire many times its size. Volunteers arrived from Sweden, from Norway, from Britain, and even a few hundred Finnish Americans and Finnish Canadians who crossed an ocean to fight for a homeland many of them had never even lived in. Humanitarian aid and small amounts of weaponry trickled in from the West, never enough to change the outcome, but enough to prove that the world was paying attention to a fight most people expected to be over in days. For a regime that had spent 2 decades building an image of the Red Army as an unstoppable modern military machine, the Winter War was becoming an international embarrassment that Soviet propaganda could no longer control. Stalin, by every account, was done being embarrassed, and the force he was about to throw at the Karelian Isthmus wasn't going to care about clever tactics, terrain knowledge, or motti pockets. It was going to care about one thing: weight. In late January, the Soviet Union completely overhauled its approach to the war. New, more competent commanders replaced the officers who had presided over the disasters at Suomussalmi and Raate Road. Fresh divisions, better winter equipment, and a staggering amount of artillery were funneled into the Karelian Isthmus. On the 1st of February 1940, the Red Army launched an offensive against the Mannerheim Line, unlike anything Finland had faced so far. artillery bombardments reaching as many as 400 rounds per minute, pounding a single stretch of frozen ground, followed by infantry and armor in overwhelming numbers. The Finns, already stretched to their absolute limit after 2 months of continuous fighting, had no answer for firepower on that scale. On the 11th of February, Soviet forces broke through the Mannerheim line for the first time in the war. Over the following weeks, the exhausted Finnish defense bent, retreated, and bent again, buying every mile with casualties they could not afford to lose, hoping desperately for a change in the weather, or for Britain and France to finally intervene with real military support. Neither came in time. By early March, Soviet forces were advancing on Viipuri, Finland's second-largest city, and the possibility of a complete Soviet occupation of the entire country had become frighteningly real. Finland's government, with no realistic path to outside rescue, made the only choice left that could preserve the nation's independence at all: negotiate for peace, while there was still a Finland left to negotiate for. The Moscow Peace Treaty was signed on the 12th of March 1940, ending what had become known as the 105-day Winter War. The terms were harsh. Finland ceded roughly 10 to 11% of its territory to the Soviet Union, including the Karelian Isthmus and the city of Viipuri, along with about a fifth of its industrial capacity. Hundreds of thousands of Finnish civilians had to abandon homes their families had lived in for generations, evacuating west ahead of the new border. But there was one thing the treaty did not take, and it was the one thing Stalin had actually invaded to secure: Finland's independence. Unlike Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, all forced into full Soviet annexation within the same year, Finland remained a sovereign, self-governed nation. It kept its own government, its own laws and its own army. That single distinction is the entire reason military historians still study this war today. A nation nobody expected to survive walked away bruised, smaller and grieving, but free. The cost to get there was staggering on both sides. Finland lost approximately 25,900 soldiers, killed or missing, out of a population of 3.5 million, a wound that touched nearly every town and family in the country. Soviet losses were far higher, with credible estimates ranging from over 126,000, confirmed dead up to 150,000 or more when missing, and non-combat losses are included, out of a force that had grown to over 750,000 men by the war's end. Years later, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev would admit in his own memoirs that even in victory, the entire Soviet leadership, Stalin most of all, felt they had actually suffered a defeat at the hands of the Finns, and that this humiliation only encouraged their enemies to see the Soviet Union as a giant standing on feet of clay. Numbers like these are exactly why we dig this deep into every battle we cover. If you want the next one delivered straight to you, this is a good time to subscribe. 15 months later, that giant would find out exactly how right that warning was, when a much larger, much colder invasion crossed a much longer border and paid for it in ways the world had never seen before. There is a reason this story has outlasted 80 years of history books, war colleges, and documentaries. It isn't really about tactics or tanks or a sniper's kill count, as remarkable as all of that is. It's about what a nation is capable of when it refuses to believe its size determines its fate. Finland had every reason, by any rational military calculation, to collapse in the first 2 weeks. It didn't have the tanks, it didn't have the planes, it barely had the rifles. What it had was men who knew their land, a command structure willing to improvise rather than follow doctrine off a cliff, and a people bound together by faith, family, and a shared refusal to hand their home to an empire that had already crushed 3 of their neighbors that same year. Simo Hayha's own words about that first frozen Christmas, that even surrounded by death they found God close, and they sang psalms, capture something this entire war proves again and again. Courage under pressure this extreme rarely comes from confidence in the odds. It comes from conviction in what's worth defending, and a willingness to hold the line anyway, one motti, one road, one winter at a time. Finland's freedom, in the end, wasn't given to it by a treaty. It was earned, mile by frozen mile, by people the world had already counted out. If this story hit you the way it hit us putting it together, that's exactly why we make these videos. Hit like if you want to see more forgotten stands like this one, subscribe if you want to be here for the next one, and drop a comment telling us which battle from history you think deserves this same treatment. Because next time we're heading to a fight where the odds were somehow even worse, and the men who faced them had even less reason to believe they'd walk away. See you there.